Okay, welcome to our third week of child psychology. This is our second lecture of the week. Today we are talking about, still the first 2 years of life, and we're talking about cognitive development. Okay, so let's get started. This is not the most interesting chapter. And sometimes it's a little bit difficult. There will be some parts of this chapter, this lecture, that will be a little bit difficult. But we're going to talk about depth perception. We're going to talk about memory. We'll talk about Piaget, and we'll talk about language. And the part about Piaget's theory, that can be a little bit complicated, just to warn you guys. Okay, but first let's talk about something that's not so bad, depth perception. So depth perception is the ability of people basically to see things at a distance, to see that there's depth or distance, to see that there's a drop off, okay? And how do we know that infants have depth perception? Or how do we know when they have developed that? Well, there's a classic experiment known as the visual cliff experiment. Which provides an illusion that there's a drop-off. Let me show you that, and then I'll come back over here. Let me show you a picture of that so you understand. Here's an image of the visual cliff. So it's basically a piece of glass that has been put over a table. The table has a cloth on it, and then there's a piece of glass over it. And it's made to look like basically, you know, like after the table ends, that there's a drop off, there's a cliff. But in reality, the glass extends further, and if the child, should want to, the child can crawl over that glass. And they clean it very well. And then mommy or daddy are on the other side, usually mommy on the other side. Mommy calls to the child, and they want to see if the child will crawl across the table and continue going past the point where the table ends, where it looks like there's a cliff or a drop off. And you can see this child has gone over the edge basically, and looks like she's going to fall, but there's glass there. So this is the experiment that is used to determine if children actually can perceive depth or distance. Okay, so what did the results of this experiment show? The results show that basically a 6-month-old infant can be enticed to crawl over the edge. At the time, developmental psychologists believe that means that 6 months old don't yet have the ability to perceive distance or to perceive a sudden drop off. Okay, so when their mother called to them on the other side, the infants would crawl over. And that would mean that if there really was a cliff there, they would fall, that they can't see the drop off. But a 10-month-old refused to crawl over the edge, even when enticed by the mother. So the mother's on the other side calling to them, and they refuse. And that, probably indicates that they can see the drop off. They're scared. They don't want to do it. Okay. But new research reveals that it's a little bit more complicated than that. New research reveals that even 3 months old know the difference between a solid surface and an apparent cliff. So even 3-year-olds can probably detect that there's a difference there, that there's a sudden drop off, because their heart rate slows, their eyes are wide open when they are placed over the edge. Meaning that, well, there's some physiological changes, right? Their eyes open wide, and that's usually indicative of that there's some concern, some fear, and their heart rate slows down. Now, the heart rate slowing down, I don't really understand that. Usually your heart rate speeds up when you are fearful. But there are some physiological changes that take place, which might indicate that 3 months old really can detect that, that visual cliff, that drop off. But because they're only 3 months old, they can still be enticed by the mother to crawl over. In other words, I guess they're, they go with, that instinct to be near their mother. So it might be a little bit more complicated is what I'm saying. Okay, let's keep going. That's the visual cliff. There's the image again. Let's keep going. Now let's talk about memory. What is the memory of an infant like? What is memory like? What is early memory like during those first 2 years? According to classic developmental theory, infants store no memories in their first year. That's what researchers believed, early on, decades ago, that that infants in their first year, that they store no memories. Memory doesn't work. But as a matter of fact, they do store memories. It's just that their memory is different. We'll get to that soon. Developmentalists now agree that very young infants can remember things, okay? They can remember under the following conditions. If the environmental conditions are similar to real life. In other words, if their memory is tested in such a way that it's similar to their home environment, then they do show evidence of memory. If motivation is high, the issue with infants is often they don't care, or they just won't follow directions, and it doesn't mean that they don't remember. It doesn't mean they can't do something. When special measures aid retrieval, when certain things are done basically to remind them of something, then that can trigger a memory, and that can be measured. So young infants do form memories, and we'll talk a little bit more about how that is. So a little bit more about memory here. So memory, so 3 months old, even 3-month-old infants can be taught to make a mobile move by kicking their legs. A mobile is just a little thing that kind of dangles there. Sometimes parents, buy these little things for their infants so that they can play and reach and grab for them. So basically, there's several versions of them, if I'm thinking about this correctly, but they can be lying down and there's a little arc over them with little things that dangle there, little toys or little things that are basically hanging there by strings. And the infant will sometimes reach and grab for these, and sometimes they make sounds, and and they'll play with these things. Well, infants can be taught to make the mobile move by kicking their legs. And if there is learning, if they can be taught that, that means they do remember. Learning and memory go together. One doesn't exist without the other, okay? 6-month-olds can retain info with even less training, less reminding, according to research. 1-year-olds are capable of what we call deferred imitation, which means they can watch something and imitate it later, okay? A 9-month-old, for instance, can watch someone play with a new toy and then can play it with the same way a day later, indicating that they remember something. 2-year-olds can remember and reenact more complex sequences, of course. They're capable of more complex things. Like a 20-month-old can put a doll to bed, make a party hat, clean a table, even a week after seeing someone perform those activities. So they're capable of doing more complex things a week after they saw somebody do that, indicating they have memory. Now, there's no doubt 2-year-olds have memory, but remember, those early psychologists believe that in the first year of life that, infants store no memories, but recent research shows that that is not true. Here's the thing. We have to think about memory in a different way. There's actually, if you want to think of it broadly, there's 2 kinds of memory. There's implicit memory and there's explicit memory. Implicit memory is memory that remains hidden until a stimulus or something brings it out, okay? Implicit memory is memory that is basically, it's implied. It's kind of hard to see, hard to talk about, okay? And with implicit memory, we're usually talking about motor skills and habits, emotional responses. Here's the thing that people don't realize. With motor skills and habits, we're usually talking about movements. These are things the infant does again and again. Crawling, okay, walking, waving their little hand. They may not necessarily be waving at someone, but they can move their arm. They can do things like that. Well, guess what? Movement involves memory. We don't think of memory as being movement as involving memory, but it does. It's an implicit kind of memory. But yes, as you're growing and developing, you are learning. You're learning to do things. You're learning to walk and babble and all those things. All that involves memory. Now, babbling is different. That would be more explicit memory. But motor skills, movement involves memory, and also emotional responses. If a child basically is afraid of a cat, and it's a cat that basically scratched them, let's say a few days ago, and now they're afraid of the cat, that shows they have memory. They have an emotional memory. And this is the kind of memory we see in young infants, okay? The memory is there, but it's implicit. They can't tell us they remember something, but they can show us in some ways. A 3-month-old, for instance, can remember after 2 weeks to make a mobile move by kicking their legs. If you have a reminder session, if you tie their little leg, so they can be taught to make that mobile move by tying their little leg to the little thing that dangles, and they can be taught to play with it by making their leg move. Well, 2 weeks later, they will play with it again in that same way. If you remind them, if you again tie their leg to the mobile, they will play with it the same way. They can't tell you that they remember, but they can show you. That's implicit memory. Okay, motor skills, habits, usually we're talking about movements there, and then emotional responses, you know, they fear something or they're happy when they see mommy. That implies memory as well. Now, developmentalists believe that, you know, infants didn't store any memories because they were thinking about explicit memory. Those early developmentalists didn't believe that infants can store memories in their first year because they were thinking about explicit memory. Explicit memory is memory that can be recalled on demand, usually with words. Explicit memory is memory that is easy to talk about. So consciously learn words, data, concepts. So information, like you remember what your name is, you remember what a dog is, you know, you remember that that a ruler has 12 inches, things like that, things that you can say, information, you know, data, concepts, those things like that. That's explicit memory. That's the kind of memory that, you know, is tested on an exam. But implicit memory really has to do with memory of things that you can do or emotions. That is memory as well. And that's the kind of memory that infants show. Let's keep going. Okay, so that was memory. Now let's talk about Piaget's theory of development. We're talking about, this chapter is on cognitive development. We need a theory to help us understand how children are developing cognitively during this time. And Piaget, Jean Piaget, has the most influential theory of cognitive development. And according to Piaget, infants progress through stages of cognitive development. They go through stages. In some stages, in early stages, they're capable of doing some things, but other things can be very difficult. And when they enter a later stage, that thing that they couldn't do now becomes easy. And then there may be other deficits, other things that they can't do until they get to the last stage. So here's the thing. Piaget also said that children learn and adapt through their environment in 2 ways. One is assimilation and the other is accommodation. Assimilation is easy. Assimilation is when you apply an old idea to something new. Like, like sucking, basically. The infant, let's say, knows how to suck on a breast, does that instinctively, right? And then the infant a bottle is placed near the infant's mouth and the infant will also suck on a bottle. That is assimilation. That is taking something that they already know how to do and applying it to something new. Okay, taking an old idea like sucking, something they already know how to do, and using that same old idea for a new thing that is presented. And they're also learn and adapt to their environment through accommodation. Accommodation is a little bit more difficult. Accommodation is when they have to adjust their old idea to a new experience. So accommodation is when they have to tweak or they have to do something slightly different, you know, to basically adjust to the new reality. And here I have a similar example here. The infant sucks on a bottle differently than a breast. See, when the child is first presented with a bottle, okay, at first the child will try assimilation and will try to suck on that bottle the same way it sucks on a breast. And when the child does that, the child will quickly learn that that doesn't work. See, because sucking on a breast requires tongue pushing. Sucking on a bottle does not. So if the infant should try to suck on the bottle by pushing with the tongue, he's actually going to basically make it so that, you know, the milk can't flow. Okay. So the infant has to adjust that old idea. Suck basically on the bottle a little bit differently without using the tongue. And that will be accommodation. Accommodation is basically when you take, an old way of doing things and you change it slightly. You modify it to deal with the new reality. That's accommodation. Let's keep going and let's actually talk about these stages of development according to Piaget. Now, some of you may remember this from 101, or hopefully a lot of you. I covered Piaget's theory in Psych 101 when we got to the chapter on development, but I covered the easy version of it. And some of you may have heard the easy version before of his theory. In this class, you get the longer, fuller, more complicated version. And it's that first stage that it's really a little bit more complicated. So Piaget determined that infants progress through stages of development, through 4 stages actually, 4 main stages: the sensory motor period, the pre-operational period, the concrete operational period, and the formal operational period. We're only going to talk about the sensory motor period today because it spans basically from birth to 2 years of age, the first 2 years of life. And that is what we're talking about during this chapter. That is the stage that we're at. But see, the sensory motor period is going to be broken up into substages. Substages that fall under primary circular reactions, secondary circular reactions, and tertiary circular reactions. And you may not have heard about these before. It's a little bit complicated, but I'll try to explain it in a way that makes sense. But it's going to take some effort to be able to remember these and keep yourself from confusing them. Okay. So the pre-operational period, okay, starts with primary circular reactions. Remember that the pre-operational period, if you remember from Psych 101, the pre-operational period, the sensory motor period, I'm getting it wrong. The sensory motor period is what it's called. It's sensory motor period, okay? It's called the sensory motor period because it really has to do with movement, that's motor, and the senses, reflexes, okay? That's what it has to do with. Infants are not capable of very much at the beginning. So the sensory motor period, first basically, the first couple of stages there fall under the period of primary circular reactions. And primary circular reactions are responses to the infant's own body. So what is the infant capable of at the beginning? Not much, basically. They can use their senses, they have reflexes, and they explore these, okay? So stage 1 is called the stage of reflexes. Birth to about 1 month of age, all infants are really capable of is using their reflexes. Things that are basically hardwired, instinctive. They don't have to learn these things. So the infants will explore these reflexes. They'll suck their thumb. Why do they suck their thumb? Because their hand happened to come near their face, and they'll suck their thumb instinctively. You know, they suck a breast instinctively. They also suck their thumb instinctively, or anything you put near them. They'll suck on whatever you put near them, a ball, a toy. That's what infants do. They will also grasp things instinctively. They will stare. These are things they do, and they're just reflexes. They haven't learned anything yet. They haven't learned how to use these in a different way, but they're just exploring their reflexes. You know, they're looking, they're, they're grabbing things if something is put near their hand. They put things in their mouth. That's what they do. Okay. Stage 2, they enter basically what are called the first acquired adaptations or habits. So with stage 2, they change from reflexes to deliberate actions. So they're actually thinking a little bit. So with stage 2, they will still be doing things that seem like reflexes, except that now they do those things deliberately. So now the infant will suck on his or her thumb deliberately, on purpose, not because it happened to come near their mouth and they instinctively sucked on it, okay? They do it purposely. They will bring their little hand to their mouth and they will suck on that thumb, okay? That's a little bit different. They did it on purpose, not instinctively, okay? They can differentiate between objects, okay? Like a pacifier and a breast, which is similar to basically a bottle and a breast. They will accommodate, and they'll learn that sucking on a breast requires tongue pushing, but sucking on a pacifier or a bottle does not. So that's basically primary circular reactions, stage 1 and 2. So primary circular reactions involve stage 1 and 2. Like I said, we have substages here, okay? And those are responses to the infant's own body. So the infant is using his or her own body basically to explore those reflexes, okay? That's stage 1. And then when they do things deliberately, that is stage 2, but they're still using their reflexes. Let's keep going. We enter secondary circular reaction after that. And secondary circular reactions involve responses to objects and people. So with secondary circular reactions, the infant will now respond not just to his or her own body, but objects in the environment and people, usually mommy or daddy, okay? It includes stages 3 and 4, okay, substages 3 and 4. So stage 3, 4 to 8 months, is called the awareness of things. So they become more aware of things. And remember, they will respond to things around them. So now they will vocalize, make sounds, basically. They'll stare, they'll smile at an object or at a person to make interesting events last. So this little girl will, gaze and smile, at daddy, basically, to keep daddy's attention. You can see the picture there. That's what she's doing. So now she's responding to people and objects in her environment. Infants will also shake their arms, or laugh when you put a rattle in their hand. Or maybe they see a cat and the cat is cute and they'll laugh or smile because they see the cat. Okay, so now they are responding to things around them, objects, things, people, animals, that kind of stuff, and they'll smile, they'll laugh, and basically are doing things to try to maintain attention or to try basically to make something interesting last. That's stage 4 of secondary circular reactions. Stage 3. Stage 4 of secondary circular reactions lasts from about 8 months to 1 year. And this is called new adaptation and anticipation. So they become capable of new adaptation and anticipation. Let me explain that. Okay. During stage 4, they become capable of what's called goal-directed behavior. So now infants will do things to achieve certain goals, to make certain things happen. Like an infant can grab the bar of soap and show mom that it's time for a bath. They'll grab the bar of soap, basically telling mom, hey, it's time for my bath. Or the infant will tug at mommy's dress, telling mommy, hey, don't leave. So the infant now is trying to accomplish things, not just stare at things, but is trying to make things happen. Infants also develop object permanence during this stage. Okay, and object permanence is when they see and hear something. Object permanence, develops, it has to do with knowing something still exists, even if you don't see or hear it. So they understand that objects and people exist, where they don't see or hear them. So if a little ball should roll away, let's say, into another room, an infant that has object permanence will go after the ball. They know it still exists even if they don't see it. Or if you place a ball under a blanket, they'll reach under there and grab it. They have object permanence. If a child does not have object permanence, by the way, a ball that rolls away under the couch or in another room will be immediately forgotten. If they don't see it, they don't hear it, it does not exist for them. That is when they lack object permanence. Children also like to play peekaboo during this time. From 7 to 12 months, they find the game peekaboo very, very fun. And that is because they are developing object permanence. So with playing peekaboo, what you do is they'll place their hands on their face and they'll open them. Often let me explain it this way. The parent will often do this with a blanket or with their hands. They'll cover their face and then they'll uncover their face and they'll say peekaboo, right? So it's like they're appearing and disappearing. Okay. And the infants will, basically find this hilarious. They'll find it funny. It's interesting to them. Let's keep going. And then we enter the stage of tertiary circular reactions. Okay, tertiary circular reactions includes stages 5 and 6, and there's a little bit more complicated. With tertiary circular reactions, the first stage 5 there, it's called new means through active experimentation, the little scientists. So basically infants will act like scientists, like little scientists. They'll explore things and they'll experiment with things. It looks like they're experimenting with things. Okay, like this infant there that you can see on the, right there in the picture, is touching the vent and probably running the fingers across the vent and is realizing that that makes a sound. And the infant will play with that and try to produce that sound, try to experiment with that. So the infant here is trying to produce something new, some novelty, right? Not just repeat things. An infant may also drop things from different heights to produce different sounds, or to see how high a ball bounces, you know, when they drop it from just a few feet or a few inches. Okay, so that's stage 5. They're acting like little scientists. And then we enter stage 6 of tertiary circular reactions. That's 18 to 24 months. New means through mental combinations is what that's called. So now infants will anticipate and solve problems. They'll try various actions mentally before performing them. So they'll actually try to figure something out in their heads before they actually do it. So for instance, a child can see their brother run down the hall. Well, notice that the child was not punished for running down the hall. They'll wait, they'll think, and then they'll do the same thing. So they'll think about it in their own heads before, okay, before they actually do it. Pretend play begins, okay? The child can tuck a doll into a bed, you know, play house like this little girl over here. That's pretend play. That's part of stage 6 of tertiary circular reactions. They're also capable of deferred imitation, which we talked about before. That's part of memory, right? Where they'll copy behavior that they've noticed hours or days earlier. They'll pretend to use a phone hours after seeing mommy use a phone. And often parents will buy children little toy phones because they want to do the same things that adults do. They see them on the phone, they see them, you know, washing dishes, stuff like that. So we'll buy children little toy phones, little toy pots and pans, toy food, so they can pretend that they're cooking food. Toy shovels, so they can pretend to be like dad, you know, when he's working in the yard. Okay. That's what this is. That is deferred imitation. Okay, let's keep going. Here's a little bit of a review to make it easier for you guys to understand. And there's a link to a video there that I'm not going to play because when I have tried to play a video, it doesn't work out very well. And then it ruins the whole recording. Okay, not all of it, but it ruins this part of the recording. So primary circular reactions, remember that has to do with actions to the infant's own body. That's why it's called primary. It has to do with the infant's own body. The infant will suck their thumb and they enjoy sucking, so they'll do that again. They can do that deliberately or reflexively, depending on whether it's stage 1 or stage 2. Secondary circular reactions are actually called secondary circular reactions because they involve responses to objects and people. So it's secondary. It's not just about themselves. So they'll smile, stare at somebody else or at a cat or a toy, right, to try to make something interesting last. And tertiary circular reactions is when they basically, you know, they try to do things to get a, you know, a pleasing result or to produce something new. Like there, the baby steps on a rubber duck, right? It makes a sound that they like. Baby squeezes the rubber duck, trying to produce the same sound, right? And the duck squeaks. Okay, and they enjoy that and they do that again. So they're experimenting, they're trying things out. Okay, like I said, there's a link there that you can watch. You guys can watch that on your own. Now let's talk about language. How does language develop? Well, before we talk about the development of language in infants, we need to talk about something known as baby talk. Adults, when they talk with their infants, with their babies, they will often use very simple high-pitched sounds, okay? And this is called baby talk. And people often use this with their pets as well, by the way. It's little cute high-pitched sounds. it's hard for me to imitate this stuff, you know, when I don't have an infant in front of me or a cat or something like that, but it'll be something like, you know, something like this, like, who's a good girl? You know, you're a good girl. Who's mommy's little sweetie, right? That kind of stuff. I feel silly, you know, trying to talk that way, but when you're with an infant, it doesn't seem so silly and you do it almost instinctively. Research shows that infants actually like it when you talk to them that way. Okay, and it's good for them. It maintains their attention, and it's something useful. Okay, but of course, as they get older, you need to talk to them more normally. Okay, because they shouldn't grow up thinking that's the way people talk. Let's talk about language development in infants. Okay, so newborns are not capable of much language, but they do have language. A newborn mostly just cries. Okay, that's the way they communicate with you. They cry to tell you that they're hungry, that they're cold, that they're in pain, that they're tired, right? But also little movements. Sometimes they're happy and they'll just move their little arms and legs and they look like they're excited. Their facial expressions, you can tell when they're sad, right? When they're happy. That's the way they communicate with you. A lot of it is just crying, but there's also movements and facial expressions. By the second month, infants start making more meaningful noises, noises that we refer to as cooing. And these are vowel-like sounds, you know, that basically like fussing and laughing. But let me explain cooing first. Cooing is basically like little oohs and ahs, like ooh, ah, eh, you know, like little sounds like that. They start making those little sounds. And there's also fussing, you know, making little noises that have to do with fussing. And even what seems to be like laughing, but it's not real laughter yet, but they start making sounds like that. But cooing is the important thing that happens by the second month. By 3 to 6 months, you'll hear squeals, growls, grunts, and yells, different sounds that are not just vowels. It's like the beginning of those consonant sounds, you know, especially a growl. In a growl, it kind of sounds like there's an R in there somewhere. So they start making these sounds, okay, that are starting to sound like language. By 6 to 9 months, you start to hear babbling, okay? Repeated consonant vowel sounds like ba, 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 na, na, you know, oh, ta, ta, you know, and that will eventually become their first words. But at this point, it's just babbling. They're just repeating sounds, combining consonant and vowel sounds, and they're just repeating them. And that will become their first words. By the first year, they'll begin to produce their first words. And this will usually be simple vowel sound combinations, mama, papa. So it's like babbling, except that now you're putting it together into words. Mama, papa, tata, kaka, you know, that kind of stuff. And keep in mind that infants develop language at different times. Girls seem to develop language faster than boys on average. And some kids develop language quite quickly and some are behind. So children can be all over the place. These are averages that we're talking about. Okay, your infant might be developing language faster than this or slower than this. My son was behind, my daughter was way ahead. Okay, 13 to 18 months, they have, you know, vocabulary starts growing, okay, slowly. 13, so by 13, 18 months, they probably have a vocabulary of about 50 words, okay? And at 18 months, there's what we call a vocabulary spurt or a naming explosion. By 18 months, they start learning words very, very quickly, like 3 or more per day. And these words that they're learning are mostly nouns, pee pee, poo poo, na na, ta ta, you know, things like that. Okay. They're mostly things that are physical because that's what they understand. They don't understand things that are symbolic yet. Okay. That's much more complicated. Words usually refer to people, animals, and toys, physical things. Okay? Not going to refer to numbers or ideas or anything like that. They're not capable of that yet. And they use these things called hollow phrases. They will basically use one word to mean different things. Like the word ball can mean, you know, basically like ball, like is that a ball? Or it can mean ball, you know, or it can mean like ball. I want the ball. It could mean I want the ball. Is that a ball? Those kind of things. And they, you know, they also use overextensions. They'll use like the word car, for instance, for a car, for a truck, for a van, for a motorcycle. when all those things are vehicles, but they use the word car for everything. And those are problems that we see early on, but vocabulary is developing very quickly. Language is developing very, very quickly. Children, it's amazing how quickly they learn language. And I should point out their native language. We'll talk about foreign languages down the road. More about language development. By 21 months, you start to see the first 2-word sentences, and it'll be simple things like more juice, baby cry, things like that, right? They have difficulty with tense. So they'll make grammatical errors, instead of saying something like I went, which is complicated for them, they'll say me go, or I want to go, they'll say me go, right? But they're trying to put those words together to make sentences or phrases. By 24 months, they're using telegraphic speech, which means they're using multiple word speech. Half of their sentences are 2 or more words. They'll say things like give baby milk, baby go to bed, baby go night night, something like that. That's by 24 months. And like I said before, keep in mind, there are vast differences between infants, okay? Girls develop language faster than boys. And my daughter, by the time she was 24 months old, she was way ahead of this already, okay? My son, on the other hand, when he was 2 years old already, he was still just saying a word here and there. He's on the autism spectrum. So he's behind and has trouble producing speech. And when he does say things, it doesn't always sound right. And he goes to speech therapy for that and other kinds of things. There's also gesturing. Gesturing is also language. Things like pointing or sign language is gesturing. All infants actually can gesture. Concepts that with gesture are expressed sooner than speech. So infants can actually learn to gesture before they actually learn to talk. They occur even without adults signing, without adults teaching them to sign, right? Like pointing emerges in human babies around 10 months. That's before they start saying their first words. They can point. They can't say what that is, but they can point and say that they want something or look at that, This mother here is teaching her 12-month-old the sign for more by using sign language. And children can learn these things early on, even before they're capable of expressing those things with words. That's gesturing. It's a very important thing to know, especially if your infant has trouble with language. You can maybe teach them to gesture. Let's talk about theories of language development. These are simple. It's not that hard. Behaviorism, that's one explanation for language. Remember the theory of behaviorism you learned from 101? Behaviorism says that everything is learned, that we learn everything through rewards and punishment. And one of the main proponents of behaviorism was Skinner. You can see his picture there. According to Skinner, infants learn to associate words with objects, especially if there's reinforcement, especially if there's, for instance, some kind of reward. That's a type of reinforcement, okay? So it usually goes something like this. The child will say something that sounds like language, and then the parent will get happy and excited, and they'll give attention to the infant, and they'll smile, right? And so therefore the infant will say or try to say something similar, or will continue making sounds like that. The parents reward the child for basically making sounds and developing language all along the way. So parents teach infants to repeat words, providing objects. This is a ball. Can you say ball? Or here's a bottle. Say bottle. And they say bottle. Good. So we reward children for using language, and they develop it along the way. We smile, we reward them. That's how we learn language, according to Skinner. We start making little vowel sounds, vowel sounds, little cooing sounds. Parents get happy, they smile at the infant. So the infant learns that that's desirable. So they continue making those little cooing sounds, and eventually it turns to babbling, and they get rewarded for that. And then babbling becomes their first words. And all along the way, you're getting happy, you're rewarding them, and they're learning that language is something that they should produce to get rewards. Children also learn to imitate people, the sounds that they make and the things that they do. But here we're talking about language, so they learn to imitate language, and hearing language is important for them, so they can imitate it. Here's a graph here that shows you the importance of maternal responsiveness. Basically, what this is showing here is that infants acquire language faster if they have a mother that's very responsive. That's the blue line there. You can see percent of infants knowing at least 50 words. That's the scale on the vertical line there, scale on the left. And then the horizontal line there is the age of the infant in months. And you can see that infants develop language much more quickly if they have a mother that is very responsive. Those mothers that are in the top 10% of responsiveness, no, the ones that pay a lot of attention to their infants, talk to them a lot, play with them a lot, those infants will develop language faster. And then we have the infants of mothers that are in the bottom 10% of responsiveness. Those are the mothers that ignore their children a lot, don't talk to them a lot, don't play with them a lot. So they're not rewarded a lot for using language. They develop language more slowly. If you are not exposed to language, if you do not hear language early on, it will slow down your language development. Because yes, rewards and punishments, imitation is important. And that is, that's what behaviorism says. It says that we learn language by basically imitating others and by being rewarded for producing that language and being punished for basically not producing language. Developmentalists have said that it can't just all be rewards and punishments. That cannot be what explains language, completely. Sure, rewards and punishments help, but according to others like Chomsky, the brain must also be involved here. There must be a reason why we learn language so quickly. And Chomsky reasoned that, we have something called a language acquisition device in the brain. Now, there is no such part of the brain, by the way, that's called the language acquisition device. But there are areas of the brain that are involved with language. Okay, and there's more than one, there are several. But language reasoned, even, before we knew about these things, that children must have some structure in the brain that allows them to learn language and grammar very quickly, very rapidly. Because they learn it so quickly, it can't possibly be rewards and punishments that matter. It can't. Sure, that helps, but that can't be what explains language completely. Experts have said that it would take infants 100 years to learn language if it was just rewards and punishments. The brain must actually be hardwired to learn language. It's part of brain development, in other words. Language development requires maturation of the brain, neurons and pathways. Okay. Reinforcement is too slow to account for the fast rate of language development. Are you really rewarding your infants for every single word that they learn? Especially when they get to the naming explosion, when they start learning 3 or more words per day, you're probably not rewarding them for that. Okay. Sure, they're hearing language, and they are being rewarded, but the brain is also primed and ready to learn language. The brain, the development of the brain also basically allows them to learn language very quickly, much quicker than they otherwise would through just rewards and punishments. Social pragmatic theory says that children basically are social and that language is a way to connect with others. We learn languages basically because we are social beings. We need to communicate and interact with others. That's what the theory says. So children are social beings that acquire language as a way to connect with others. We're dependent on others for survival, for joy. So we have to learn to communicate and interact with people. Language is very important for that, okay? We're compelled to be social, even as newborns. We learn to vocalize, to babble, to gesture, to listen, to point in order to communicate and interact with people. We look intently at faces. We're attracted to human voice. We are social. Social pragmatic theory. Social means that basically we're social and we need to be with others. And pragmatic means it's just that we need language to do practical things, to communicate, to basically, to work together, to get protection, to get the things we want. We're part of groups and we need to communicate in order to function within those groups, even as infants. We quickly learn to communicate in order to achieve that. That's what the theory says. A hybrid theory, this just says that basically some aspects of language can be explained by one theory at one age, and then another theory is better at explaining language at a different age. A hybrid theory, that just means a combination of theories. So all these theories that we just mentioned, there were 3 of them, they're all useful. They all explain language in their own way, And they're not wrong. It's just that they are all involved. Yes, reinforcement is important. Rewards are important for learning language and imitation, but so is the brain. And so are our social connections, our relationships. And that's what hybrid theory says, that basically it's a combination of things that is happening that explain language. It's not just one theory doesn't explain it all. How language is learned depends on the age of the child, as well as the circumstances, you know, that are occurring. Okay, that is the end there. So I'll stop recording.